Hello there! In this video we're going to look at what would have happened if Vader had killed Palpatine at the end of Revenge of the Sith. You know the scene, the one where Vader's just been put in his suit and then he shouts no and crushes everything, but this time he would also kill Palpatine while crushing everything. Now again, this is a suggestion from one of you guys, just like the other videos I've done recently have been. So if you've got a suggestion you'd like to see, put it in the comments and it might end up getting made. Also, just before we start, big thank you to everyone for subscribing and liking the recent videos. The reception on them has been amazing. But without further ado, let's go! Vader would have just been put in his suit, and then he would ask, "Where is Padme? Is she safe? Is she alright?" To which Palpatine would respond, "It seems that in your anger you killed her." Vader couldn't believe it. She was alive. He had felt it. But unlike in Revenge of the Sith, Vader would briefly consider. She had been alive. He had felt it. And Palpatine had promised to save her, yet now she was dead. So Vader this time would direct his anger, his hatred towards Sidious. He would destroy the medical instruments, yes. He would break out of his restraints, yes. But he would also direct anger and hatred directly towards Sidious. If Sidious had kept his promise, she would be alive. Even if Vader had been partially responsible, even though he had choked her on Mustafar, she was still alive when he last saw her, and also, he was only on Mustafar because Palpatine had told him to go there. It was all Palpatine's fault, and so Vader would kill Palpatine. After choking Palpatine to death, Vader would drop the limp body of his former mentor, and very briefly his former master, on the floor, and walk out of the room without saying a word. Vader would travel to Palpatine's office on Coruscant, as it was the only place he could actually think of to go. The only other place he had thought of was Padme's apartment, but he couldn't bring himself to go there. He would sit on Palpatine's chair and stare out of the broken window at the city, at the burning Jedi Temple. He had to focus on his anger and his hatred to prevent the despair from overcoming him. In the space of 24 standard hours, he had lost his wife, and his life, and himself. Anakin Skywalker was now dead, and in Vader's head, all he had left to live for was revenge. Unlike Palpatine, Vader had no interest in controlling the galaxy. He would only be driven by his revenge, the revenge against those who he believed had wronged him, and that was mostly the Jedi. As he dwelled on the Jedi and his anger, Maz Amida would walk in. Maz would say that he was concerned since he hadn't heard from Palpatine for a few hours. Vader would respond that Palpatine was dead, that Vader had killed him, and before Maz could respond, although he was struggling to say anything, Vader would continue. He would say that he trusted that Maz's loyalty remained to the Emperor, and that was now Vader. Without thinking, Maz would begin to ask questions, but suddenly he would feel an invisible hand grip his throat. After a pause, he would respond, "Of course, my Emperor, I am loyal." A rather tense discussion would follow, where the two would discuss how they planned to proceed. Vader had no intention of actually ruling the galaxy. He didn't want to be involved in politics, and certainly didn't want the ceremonial duties involved in being Emperor. The way he saw it, being Emperor meant everyone answered to him, so if he wanted something to happen, he could get someone like Maz Amida to represent him in the Senate, whilst he attended to more productive matters. If he wanted anyone silenced, he could have them silenced and no one would stop him. He was above the law. Vader would only really care about one thing, which was finding and killing any remaining Jedi or others who had wronged him. Because Vader wouldn't have had any Sith training really, because he'd killed his Sith master almost as soon as he'd become a Sith, he wouldn't have learnt all the rules of being a Sith, like taking a kyber crystal from a Jedi and then bleeding it, and so he would just take Sidious's kyber crystal, and he would make a new hilt. He wouldn't want to keep Sidious's hilt, because he wanted to destroy any legacy that Palpatine had left in the galaxy. And for the same reason, he would redesign his suit. Again, where a proper Sith might embrace these reminders of pain and anger, he instead would want to eradicate any memory of the people who had caused him pain. So Vader's life would consist of hunting down mostly Jedi and then killing them, and so he would design his suit to make him even more effective against Jedi. And this redesign would also be another way that he would remove Palpatine's legacy from the galaxy. However, because of his lack of presence in the Imperial Senate and generally in political affairs, the galaxy would begin to become more chaotic. Vader wasn't overly bothered about the state of the galaxy, providing he could achieve his personal vendettas, and so it would almost be as if there was an empire without its emperor. So uprisings would start to form and the underworld would flourish. Since Vader allowed others to make most of the decisions for him, after a while corruption would basically have removed all of the power that the Imperial Senate was supposed to have. The Empire would only really have any true power on core worlds with gangs or independent governments formed after uprisings being truly in charge of most of the systems. But Vader wouldn't care. He would continue hunting down and killing Jedi, and the presence of gangs on many worlds would actually help him, as many Jedi would feel an obligation to help the citizens on worlds controlled by criminal organisations, and so gangs and cartels would actually draw out the Jedi, and then Vader could hunt them down and kill them when they were exposed. In this reality, no rebellion would actually form, because unlike in the actual story of Star Wars, there wouldn't be one group to unite against. Alderaan might have its own independent government which was constantly concerned about raids on the planet, whilst Chandrila may be officially governed by an Imperial Moff, but the system would actually be controlled by the Hutts. And due to this lack of true Imperial control on most planets, although citizens would be required to pay taxes to the Empire, most of the credits and resources would be lost due to corrupt local governors and raids on the shipments to the core worlds. And so there would be very little resources within the Empire to form a capable military force other than for the very few core worlds that the Empire still had some control over. There certainly wouldn't be enough resources to form a military capable of reclaiming some of the lost territories. Meanwhile, cartels and gangs would grow in power as each of them tried to take rival gang territories. But what about Luke and Leia? Well, Leia would still be brought up as the daughter of Bail and Breha Organa. However, as threats from the Raiders on Alderaan became worse, the planet would be forced to become more and more prepared to defend itself. Leia would therefore be trained in all sorts of combat from a young age, and would, as she grew up, become a very, very important military tactician. And for Luke, since Tatooine is the home of Jabba the Hutt, it would only be a matter of time before a raid on the Lars homestead took place, which required Obi-Wan Kenobi to help defend Luke. We'll say that this raid would take place about the same time that the original trilogy happens in the actual story of Star Wars. The reason it would happen so far after Palpatine being killed by Vader is because the homestead is so small that Jabba wouldn't be that bothered about it. The raid would actually only happen because a group of Jabba's men would decide that they just wanted to go and raid somewhere for fun. Obviously, word of a Jedi on Tatooine would reach Vader, and so Vader would travel to Tatooine to find this Jedi, although he wouldn't know who it was at this point. Vader would inquire of Jabba as to who the Jedi was, but Obi-Wan would manage to hear of Vader's presence on the planet before Vader had worked out that it was Obi-Wan who was on Tatooine. Obi-Wan would decide that there wasn't any point in running, as if he did, Vader would track him down regardless, and in doing so, he might find evidence as to why Obi-Wan was on Tatooine, defending Luke. So Obi-Wan would quickly travel to the Lars homestead and convince Owen that Luke needed to leave to go to Dagobah immediately. So Luke would successfully leave Tatooine and travel to meet up with Yoda. At this point, Vader would have learnt from Jabba that the Jedi had defended the Lars homestead, and that Jabba believed the Jedi to be a hermit who lived on the edge of the Dune Sea, who many referred to as Ben Kenobi. At learning this, Vader would call about half of the Imperial military to Tatooine, which, although it was small for a galactic military, was still quite a lot for one planet. He would do this to try and prevent Obi-Wan escaping, although Obi-Wan never actually intended to escape, but Vader didn't know that. By the time the Imperial military had reached Tatooine to set up the blockade, Luke would have been long gone from the planet, and so he would successfully get to Dagobah. Vader's whole purpose for having the Imperial military on Tatooine was to prevent Kenobi's escape. Vader would want to be the one to kill Obi-Wan. Once Vader got close to the Lars homestead, Obi-Wan would confront him in much the same way that he does in Episode 4, with Obi-Wan realising that he couldn't win the battle, as even if he managed to defeat Vader, which was rather unlikely anyway, then there were thousands of troopers on the planet and blockades of Star Destroyers in orbit. And also, if he died now, he could aid Luke as a Force Ghost like he does in the original trilogy. So Obi-Wan would die in basically the same way that he does in Episode 4, although he wouldn't be on the Death Star, he would be on Tatooine. However, because Jabba was part of the underworld, the news of the military presence's removal from core worlds to travel to Tatooine would spread among the underworld, and so many of the large criminal organisations would see this as an opportunity to take some of the core world territory. So skirmishers all over the core worlds would appear, some between rival gangs and organisations, and some between remaining Imperials and gangs. Imperial forces, other than the ones on Tatooine, would be forced back to Coruscant. At the news of this, Vader would quickly return to Coruscant. Unfortunately, by the time he managed to reach Coruscant, the Empire would have lost control of any of the remaining planets it had except Coruscant, and so basically Coruscant would be the only remaining Imperial planet. And soon after Vader's return to Coruscant, many of the gangs and criminal organisations would form a fragile temporary alliance and basically put the planet under siege. This would be done in an attempt to completely remove the Empire from the galaxy, as many of the organisations believed that if Vader wanted to, he still had more than enough power to reclaim at least parts of the core worlds, and from there even maybe larger parts of their territories. And so removing the Empire, they all agreed, was removing a common threat. And so what would initially start as a planet-wide siege would slowly become more and more localised just to the Senate building. The forces from the cartels and the gangs and the criminal organisations would slowly force the Imperials back into the Senate building and would prepare for a final attack. Inside the Senate building would be Vader, obviously, and many Imperial officials based on Coruscant. There would probably be about 1,000 troopers inside as well, and any remaining Imperials who weren't in the building were unable to help as they were outside of the siege and couldn't get in. And then, when Vader was in the Senate building, when it looked like the Empire that he hadn't really worked very hard to build or worked very hard to maintain was going to crumble, he would decide a few things. He would decide that although he could probably fend off this attack, it would just be followed by another and another and another. And so if he decided to defend his Empire, it would become his life. His life would be defending his Empire. And the whole reason he'd taken up the role of Emperor was to give him the power to do what he wanted, to kill Jedi. But if he decided to fight for the Empire, it would basically be restricting him into defending the Empire itself. And so, finally, in that moment when the Empire was seemingly making a final stand, he would decide that he should just let it die. Let the final legacy of Palpatine die. After all, that was what he wanted. He wanted to remove any memory of the man who he could attribute so much of his pain, so much of the pain of his existence to. So as the attack on the Senate building began, as it began to become overrun by mercenaries, bounty hunters, hired guns, Vader would decide to leave. Just leave and let the Empire die. He would leave without saying a word. He would just walk out. Leaving the building he'd walked so many times before, the corridors that seemed like a second home to him. He walked them both as Anakin Skywalker and more recently as Darth Vader. But this time, they were crawling with mercenaries, hired guns, bounty hunters. But anyone who got in his way, he would cut down. Think the hallway scene from Rogue One, but so much cooler because rather than cutting down rebels, he's cutting down hired guns, mercenaries, bounty hunters, people trained to kill, people who thought that they were the best killer in the galaxy until they met Vader. So the Empire would fall and be replaced by a galaxy divided. Some systems, like Alderaan, would be governed by an official government who had the best interests of the citizens in mind. They would constantly be fending off attacks from raiders. Some systems would have a puppet government, but the power would actually be controlled by a gang or criminal organisation. And other systems would be controlled outright by cartels and gangs with no facade, no fake government in place. There would be constant skirmishes between cartels and gangs trying to gain territories. And whilst the galaxy fought over Bacta, spice and territory, a shadow would travel from system to system, tracking down remaining Jedi and killing them. But that shadow, Vader, would never hear any rumours of Grandmaster Yoda, who would be on Dagobah training Luke Skywalker to be a Jedi. Aided by Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon's ghost, Yoda would train Luke in the ways of the Force, in hopes of preserving the spark of the Jedi in the galaxy, unaware that the boy's own father wanted more than anything to extinguish that spark. And that's where I'll leave it. That's how I see Star Wars going if Vader killed Palpatine at the end of Revenge of the Sith. Now remember to let me know what you think would have happened in the comments. Do you agree with what I said, or do you think it would have gone drastically different? Let me know anything else in the comments, and remember to suggest videos like this or any other videos you'd like me to make in the future. Now before we finish, a lot of you guys have been asking for a part 2 on some of the other What If videos, so down below there's going to be a pinned comment, and if you respond to that with the What If video that you want to see a part 2 to, then whichever one is the most popular, I'll make a part 2 to. But that's about it. Remember to comment, like, subscribe, all that stuff. Thanks for watching. Bye!